My name is Clara, and I'm 36 years old. 6 months ago, I was a wife. Now, I am a widow. When my husband, Mark, died in a sudden car accident, my world didn't just shatter, it dissolved into dust. The only thing holding me together was the memory of our love. But for his family, the wealthy and powerful Camerons, his death was not a tragedy, but an opportunity. At the will reading, my parents-in-law, Richard and Eleanor, smirked at me from across the polished mahogany table. They saw me not as a grieving widow, but as a temporary inconvenience about to be removed. They were certain they were inheriting everything, but they didn't know about the last page, the one Mark had made sure only I would understand. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And before I tell you how this life-altering day unfolded, please hit that like button and subscribe. You're going to want to see how a quiet librarian, armed with a secret, took on an empire. My life before Mark was simple. I was a librarian, a profession his parents found both quaint and deeply inadequate. I found solace in the quiet order of books, in the rustle of turning pages, and in the small act of helping someone find the exact story they needed. I met Mark at a fundraiser for the city library, a place he loved as much as I did. He wasn't like his family. He was warm, brilliant, and he saw me not my job title, not my modest background, but me. He was the golden son of the Cameron dynasty, a family that had built its fortune in real estate, but he had the soul of a poet. He loved my quiet strength, he said, because it was a stark contrast to the loud, performative world he grew up in. His parents, Richard and Eleanor, never approved of me. From the moment Mark introduced us, I was a project to them, a puzzle they couldn't solve. Why would their brilliant, Harvard-educated son, poised to take over the family business, choose a librarian from a working-class family? At our first dinner at their sprawling mansion, Eleanor looked at my simple dress, the nicest one I owned, and said, "Oh, dear. Mark, we must take her shopping. She can't be seen in that." Richard was more direct. He'd corner me to ask about my life plan, his questions dripping with condescension about my salary and career prospects. He once told me, with a patronizing pat on my arm, "It's a respectable hobby, being a librarian, but you'll be a Cameron soon. You won't need to worry your pretty little head about work." For the 10 years we were married, I was never truly a Cameron. I was Mark's wife, an accessory they tolerated because Mark insisted. He protected me fiercely, creating a bubble for us in our own home, a cozy brownstone in the city that felt a million miles away from his parents' cold estate. But the injustice was a constant, low-grade hum in the background of my life. It was in the little things. At family gatherings, they would lavish praise on Mark's younger brother, Liam, a 30-year-old man-child who drifted from one failed startup to the next, each one funded by a blank check from Richard. Yet my recent promotion to head of acquisitions at the library was met with a blank stare from Eleanor, followed by, "That's nice, dear. Now, can you help the caterer in the kitchen?" I became the family's default problem solver, the one they called when they needed something done quietly and efficiently. When Liam was arrested for a DUI, it was me, not his parents, who sat with him at the precinct until 3 a.m. because Mark was out of town and his parents couldn't be bothered. When Eleanor needed to plan a last-minute charity gala, she sent me a 10-page list of demands, treating me like an unpaid event planner. I did it all for Mark, because loving him meant navigating the treacherous waters of his family. I would see the pain in his eyes when they slighted me, and I would swallow my pride, smile, and change the subject, all to keep the peace for him. One of the most telling moments happened a few years before Mark passed. He had just successfully negotiated a massive real estate deal that solidified the Cameron empire for the next generation. At the celebratory dinner, Richard stood and made a toast. To my son, Mark, he began, who has the business acumen I taught him. Then he turned to Liam. And to Liam, who has his mother's charm, which will take him just as far. He never once mentioned me. It was as if I didn't exist. Later that night, Mark held me as I cried, not from anger, but from a decade of accumulated weariness. I'm so sorry, Clara, he whispered into my hair. One day, I'll make it all up to you, I promise. They will see who you really are. I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought it was just a sweet sentiment, a husband comforting his wife. I had no idea it was a solemn vow, a plan he was already setting in motion. I had spent a decade being the quiet, compliant, invisible daughter-in-law, and I believed that was my destiny. But I was about to find out that my husband had seen my strength all along, and he had left me one last story to read, a final chapter that would change everything. The storm arrived on a Tuesday. It was a day like any other, clear and crisp. Mark had kissed me goodbye that morning, his hand lingering on my cheek. I have a meeting out of town, he said. I'll be back late. Don't wait up. Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. The call came from a state trooper in Connecticut. There had been an accident on the interstate. A truck had lost control. It was instantaneous, he said. A cold, clinical term meant to be a comfort, but it just felt like an amputation. My heart, my future, my entire world gone in a single violent moment. The days that followed were a suffocating fog of grief. Richard and Eleanor took over immediately, not to support me, but to manage the optics of the situation. My grief was raw, private, and messy. Theirs was a performance. Eleanor orchestrated the funeral like one of her charity galas, ensuring the right people were invited and the floral arrangements were suitably extravagant. She critiqued the eulogy I wrote, suggesting it was a bit too personal and should focus more on Mark's business achievements. Richard, meanwhile, was on the phone constantly, not with grieving relatives, but with business associates, reassuring them that the Cameron legacy is secure. They moved into my house, our house, without asking. They claimed it was to help me, but it felt like an occupation. Eleanor started rearranging furniture, replacing our wedding photos with formal Cameron family portraits. Liam treated our home like a hotel, leaving his clothes on the floor and helping himself to Mark's collection of expensive whiskey. They spoke about Mark's assets in hushed, excited tones when they thought I couldn't hear. The portfolio alone must be worth 8 figures, Richard murmured to Liam one evening in the study. And the house, a prime piece of real estate. My initial reaction was a numb, detached disbelief. I was a ghost in my own home, watching these strangers, these people who shared my husband's blood but none of his spirit carve up his life before he was even in the ground. I was too broken to fight, too lost in my own sorrow to even process their blatant avarice. I let them do it. I retreated into myself, clutching Mark's favorite sweater, trying to remember the scent of him, the feel of his arms around me. The first hint that something more was at play came a week after the funeral. I received a registered letter from a Mr. Abernathy, an attorney I had never heard of. Mark had always used the Cameron family's corporate law firm for everything. The letter was brief, stating that he was the sole executor of Mark's personal will and that a reading would be held in his office the following week. When I showed the letter to Richard, his face tightened. Abernathy? Never heard of him, he said, snatching the letter from my hand. This must be some old document, a formality. The real Cameron estate is handled by our firm. Don't you worry, Clara. We'll sort this out. The way he said we made it clear he meant he. He saw this as a minor bureaucratic hurdle, another piece of his son's life that he would now control. But for me, that letter was the first pinprick of light in a dark room. An unknown lawyer. A personal will. It was the first indication that Mark had a life, a plan, that his family knew nothing about. A seed of hope fragile but persistent, began to sprout in the barren landscape of my grief. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I had to see it through. As I prepared for that meeting, I felt a flicker of the woman I used to be, the quiet librarian who knew that the most important truths are often hidden in the fine print. The week leading up to the will reading was a masterclass in psychological warfare, executed with the casual cruelty that only the truly entitled can muster. The Camerons, confident that this personal will was a mere footnote to the larger family fortune they controlled, treated the upcoming meeting as a victory lap. Their behavior escalated from disrespectful to overtly predatory, and every action felt like a fresh wound on my already grieving heart. The first incident involved Mark's study. It was his sanctuary, the one room in our house that was entirely his. It was filled with his first edition books, his collection of vintage maps, and the faint, comforting scent of old paper and cedar. I had kept the door closed since he died, unable to face the emptiness. One afternoon, I came home from a walk to find Liam and Richard inside, measuring the walls. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Liam, holding a tape measure, grinned at me. "Just planning, Clara. Dad thinks this room has great light. It'll make a perfect office for me once I launch my new venture." Richard nodded in agreement. "Mark wouldn't want this space to go to waste," he said, his tone suggesting this was a noble act. "Liam needs a professional headquarters." They were not just taking a room. They were erasing him, planning to superimpose Liam's next inevitable failure over the last vestiges of my husband's presence in our home. I tried to protest, explaining that the room was exactly as Mark left it, that I wasn't ready to change anything. Eleanor, who had appeared in the doorway, placed a cold hand on my shoulder. "Now, Clara, you're being overly emotional," she said softly. "It's about moving forward. It's what Mark would want." They used him, his memory, as a weapon against me, twisting his generous spirit into a justification for their own greed. Next came the attack on my own life. Eleanor began making comments about my situation. "You'll have to be practical, of course," she said over dinner one night, a dinner I had cooked but was too upset to eat. "This house is far too large for one person. And the upkeep? Well, it's astronomical. Richard and I have been looking at some lovely, more manageable condominiums for you." She slid a glossy real estate brochure across the table. The condos were in a sterile, modern building on the outskirts of the city, miles away from the life Mark and I had built. The unspoken message was clear. Your time here is over. We are downsizing you, moving you out of the way so we can take what is rightfully ours. I tried to explain that I had a job, that I could afford the house, that it was my home. Richard laughed, a short, barking sound. "On a librarian's salary? Don't be absurd, Clara. Mark took care of you. Now we will. Be grateful." The cruelty wasn't just financial. It was personal. They started going through Mark's personal belongings, claiming items with a chilling sense of ownership. Eleanor took Mark's grandmother's wedding ring, a delicate sapphire heirloom he had given me to wear on our 5th anniversary. "This should stay in the main family line," she declared, slipping it off the jewelry box on my dresser and onto her own finger. Liam helped himself to Mark's collection of designer watches, claiming Mark had always promised them to him. Each item they took felt like a piece of my husband being stolen from me all over again. My attempt to reason with them was a complete failure. I requested a sit-down conversation, hoping to appeal to some shred of decency I believed must exist. We sat in the living room, the three of them on one couch, a unified front, and me alone in an armchair. "I know this is a difficult time for everyone," I began, my hands trembling. "But this is still my home, and these are Mark's things. I need you to respect that." Richard leaned forward, his face a mask of false patience. "Clara, we are the only family you have now. We are simply trying to manage a complicated estate for the good of everyone. You are not thinking clearly. Grief can be so confusing. It was textbook gaslighting. They framed their greed as concern, my valid objections as emotional instability. They made me feel like I was the one being unreasonable, that my desire to protect my husband's memory was a symptom of my grief-addled mind. The final confirmation that I was not crazy came from Mark's best friend, David. He came over to check on me, bringing coffee and a quiet, steadfast presence that felt like a lifeline. He saw the changes in the house, the missing photos, the tension in the air. "What are they doing, Clara?" he asked, his voice low and angry. I told him everything, the study, the condo brochure, the stolen heirlooms. David's face grew dark. He stood up and began to pace. "He knew," David said, stopping to look at me. "Mark knew they would be like this. We talked about it. He was worried about you, about what would happen if he wasn't here to protect you from them. He told me he was putting a plan in place, an insurance policy, he called it. He said if anything ever happened, I should tell you to trust Mr. Abernathy and no one else." David's words were like a key turning in a lock. An insurance policy. Trust Mr. Abernathy. Mark had anticipated this. He had seen the vipers in his own family, and he had been working to shield me from their venom even from beyond the grave. Suddenly, their actions weren't just cruel. They were the desperate scrabbling of people who suspected they were about to be cut out. The knowledge didn't erase the pain, but it ignited something else inside me. A cold, hard resolve. I had been drowning in sorrow, but now I had a purpose. I had to honor my husband's last wish. I had to see his plan through to the end. I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was the keeper of Mark's final secret, and I would not let him down. The battle for his legacy and for my future was about to begin. The day before the will reading was the darkest. It was the day the Camerons made their final, most brutal move, a move so calculated in its cruelty that it extinguished any lingering flicker of doubt I had about their intentions. It was the act that transformed my grief-fueled resolve into an armor of cold, unshakable fury. It was the moment they tried to take away the last piece of my husband that was truly mine. His words. I came home from the library, seeking a few hours of normalcy amidst the chaos, to find Eleanor in our bedroom. Not just in the room, but at my bedside table, her hands holding the small, leather-bound journal I kept there. It wasn't my journal. It was Mark's. It was a gift I had given him on our first anniversary, and for 10 years, he had filled it with his thoughts, his dreams, poems he wrote for me, and funny little observations about our life together. It was his soul on paper, and since his death, I had been reading a page every night before bed. It was how I kept him close. It was the most precious thing I had left of him. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharp enough to make her jump. She turned, clutching the journal to her chest as if it were hers. Her expression wasn't one of guilt, but of defiant ownership. "I was just looking for sentimental items," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Things that should be preserved in the main family archive." "That is a private journal," I said, my voice shaking with a rage I hadn't felt before. "It was a gift from me to him. It's filled with his personal thoughts about our marriage. You have no right." She gave me a pitying look. The kind one gives a hysterical child. "Clara, you don't seem to understand. Mark is gone. His legacy now belongs to the family. His history, his thoughts, they are part of the Cameron story. It's not appropriate for such things to be held by, well, by an outsider." An outsider. After 10 years of marriage, after loving her son with every fiber of my being, after holding his hand as he took his last breath in my heart, I was still an outsider. "Give it back to me," I said, my voice deadly quiet. I don't think so, she replied, a smirk playing on her lips. I think Richard should read this. It will give us a better understanding of Mark's state of mind. It could be important for the estate. That was it. The final, unbearable violation. They weren't just trying to take my home and my financial security. They were trying to take my memories. They wanted to seize the narrative of my marriage, to read my husband's most intimate words to me, to twist them, to use them as leverage. They wanted to own his love for me, just as they believed they owned everything else. In that moment, something inside me broke. The passive, grieving widow vanished, and in her place was a woman pushed beyond her limit. I saw with absolute, blinding clarity that these people were not family. They were invaders, scavengers picking over the bones of my life. My love for Mark, the peace I had tried to keep for his sake, meant nothing if I allowed them to desecrate his memory this way. I walked towards her, my steps slow and deliberate. For the first time, Eleanor looked uncertain, her smirk faltering as she saw the look in my eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. "You will put that journal back on my nightstand," I said, my voice low and trembling with controlled power. "You will leave my bedroom, and you will not touch another one of my husband's things again. Am I clear?" She was so taken aback by my tone that she instinctively took a step back. She placed the journal on the table, her hands shaking slightly. "There's no need to be so dramatic," she stammered. "The drama hasn't even begun," I replied. "You and Richard and Liam have made one fatal miscalculation. You assumed that because I am quiet, I am weak. You assumed that because I am grieving, I am helpless. You are about to find out how wrong you are." I watched her scurry out of the room, her composure shattered. I walked over to the nightstand and picked up the journal, holding it to my chest. The dam of my composure broke, and a single, hot tear rolled down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of rage, of clarity, of rebirth. They had intended to break me, but instead, they had forged me into something new, something stronger. Mark's promise echoed in my mind. "They will see who you really are." The time for quiet compliance was over. Tomorrow was the will reading. Tomorrow, I would not just be defending my home. I would be fighting for my husband's honor, for our love, and for the promise he made to me. Tomorrow, the Camerons would finally see the real Clara, and she would be their undoing. That night, for the first time since Mark died, I didn't cry myself to sleep. I didn't stare at the empty space beside me in bed. Instead, I sat at the small writing desk in our room, the journal Eleanor had tried to steal open before me, and I began to plan. The grief was still a heavy cloak, but now it was woven with threads of purpose. David's words and Eleanor's violation had unlocked a part of me I thought was gone forever. The methodical, strategic mind of a librarian who knew how to find the information she needed. My first call was to Mr. Abernathy's office to confirm my attendance at the 10 a.m. reading. His secretary was warm and efficient, her tone professional yet kind. "Mr. Abernathy looks forward to seeing you, Mrs. Cameron," she said, "and he asked me to remind you to please bring the item Mr. Cameron entrusted to you." The item. My heart pounded. I knew immediately what she meant. A few weeks before his death, Mark had come home with a small, ornate wooden box. It was a beautiful thing, inlaid with mother of pearl. "This is for you," he'd said, his eyes serious. "It's a puzzle box. There's a trick to opening it. I want you to keep it somewhere safe. Don't try to open it unless you really have to. Promise me." I had been charmed by the mystery, assuming it was another one of his romantic gestures. I promised, and I tucked the box away in my personal safe, hidden behind a false wall in our closet. I hadn't thought of it again until now. With trembling hands, I opened the safe and retrieved the box. It was heavier than I remembered. I sat on the floor, turning it over and over, searching for the trick. My mind raced back through our years together, searching for clues. Mark loved puzzles, riddles, and shared histories. The pattern on the box, it was a constellation. Lyra, the harp. My favorite constellation. The one we'd spent hours searching for on our honeymoon in Vermont. I traced the stars with my finger, pressing them in the order of their brightness. Vega, Sulafat, Sheliak. A faint click echoed in the silent room. A small, hidden drawer slid open on the side of the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, were two things: a single heavy brass key and a folded letter, sealed with wax bearing the Cameron family crest, but with a small, defiant crack running through it, a detail only Mark would think of. I opened the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably his. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means the unthinkable has happened, and I am no longer there to protect you. I am so sorry. I am sorry for the pain you must be in, and I am sorrier still for what I know my family will put you through. They do not see you, my love. They never have. They see your kindness as weakness and your grace as compliance. This key is for a safe deposit box at the downtown branch of the Bostonian Bank under the name Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy has the other key. He's the only lawyer I ever trusted, an old friend from college, someone completely outside my father's sphere of influence. Inside that box, you will find my real last will and testament. It is my insurance policy. It is my promise to you, the one I made all those years ago. Do not be afraid of them, Clara. You are the strongest person I have ever known. You have a quiet strength they will never understand, and because of that, they will underestimate you. Let them. Let them smirk. Let them plan. They are playing a game of chess, but they don't even know what the board looks like. You have all the power now. Use it to build the life you deserve. All my love. Forever. Mark. I clutched the letter to my chest, the paper absorbing the tears that now fell freely. Tears not of grief, but of overwhelming love and gratitude. He had seen it all. He had planned for it all. He had left me not just a weapon, but a shield, a strategy, and a final loving vote of confidence. The next morning, I did not go to the bank. I knew what was in the box. The time for that would come later. Instead, I made another call. I called David, Mark's best friend. I told him about the letter and the key. I need a witness, I said. Someone on my side. Can you come to the will reading with me? There was no hesitation. I'll be there, Clara. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Then, I did something the Camerons would never have expected. I got to work. I spent the next few hours at my laptop, not researching grief counseling, but researching the Cameron family's finances. As Mark's wife, I had access to certain joint accounts and financial statements. I began to piece together a puzzle of my own. I saw the massive loans to Liam that were never repaid. I saw the extravagant spending on Eleanor's part, charged to company credit cards. I saw the precarious financial position of one of their subsidiary companies, a detail I was sure Richard thought was hidden. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to be prepared for the fallout. When I was done, I chose my armor for the battle ahead. A simple, elegant black dress, the one Mark always said made my eyes look like the stormy sea. I put on the pearl earrings he gave me for our first Christmas. I tied my hair back in a neat, professional chignon. I looked at myself in the mirror. The grieving, helpless widow was gone. In her place stood Clara Cameron, a woman who knew her worth, armed with a final gift from the man she loved. I was ready. I picked up my purse, the puzzle box nestled safely inside, and walked out to meet David. It was time to go to the reading. It was time to finish the story Mark had started. Mr. Abernathy's office was the antithesis of the Cameron Empire. It was located in a historic brownstone, filled with antique books, worn leather chairs, and the quiet dignity of old Boston. There was no gleaming glass or cold marble, only the comforting scent of wood polish and paper. Mr. Abernathy himself was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He greeted David and me with a sad, knowing smile. "Clara," he said, shaking my hand warmly. "Mark spoke of you often. He loved you very much." The Camerons were already there, seated around a large oak conference table. Richard, Eleanor, and Liam. They looked like three crows, dressed in expensive black suits, their faces arranged in masks of solemnity that did not quite reach their eyes. When they saw me enter with David, a flicker of annoyance crossed Richard's face. "This is a private family matter," he said, his voice laced with authority. "David is here at my request," I replied, my voice steady. We took our seats opposite them, creating a clear line in the sand. Mr. Abernathy sat at the head of the table. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Mark Cameron," he began, his voice formal. "As per his instructions, I am the sole executor." He broke the seal on a thick envelope and began to read. The first few pages were standard legal boilerplate. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Richard was leaning back in his chair, a picture of smug confidence. Eleanor was examining her nails. Liam was scrolling through his phone under the table. They were bored, waiting for the inevitable announcement of their inheritance. "And as for my personal effects," Mr. Abernathy read, "my collection of watches is to be bequeathed to my brother, Liam Cameron." Liam looked up from his phone, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He caught my eye and gave a little wink, as if to say, "See, it's starting." My grandmother's sapphire ring, and all other family heirlooms currently in my possession, are to be returned to my mother, Eleanor Cameron. Eleanor gave a delicate, satisfied sigh and patted her finger, where the ring she had already taken was resting. She shot me a look of pure pity. "And my shares in the primary Cameron Holdings Corporation are to be transferred to my father, Richard Cameron, to ensure the continuity of the family business." Richard puffed out his chest, the patriarch confirmed in his power. He looked directly at me, his expression a mixture of condescension and finality. "This," his eyes said, "is how the world works." The room was thick with their smug satisfaction. They thought it was over. They had gotten everything they wanted. Now all that was left was the final, dismissive crumb to be thrown to the widow. "And now," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice lowering slightly, "we come to the disposition of the residuary estate. This includes the brownstone residence, all liquid assets, investment portfolios, and remaining personal property." He paused, looking over his glasses at Richard. Mark was very specific about this section. Richard gave a magnanimous wave of his hand. "Of course. We have already discussed making a generous provision for Clara. A trust fund, perhaps? Enough to ensure she's comfortable." "That will not be necessary, Richard," Mr. Abernathy said quietly. He then cleared his throat and continued reading from the document. "I hereby declare that my residuary estate, in its entirety, is to be held in a trust. The sole beneficiary and trustee of this trust is to be my beloved wife, Clara Cameron." The silence in the room was absolute. Liam's phone clattered to the floor. Eleanor's perfectly manicured hand froze on its way to her pearls. Richard's face, which had been a mask of supreme confidence, began to crumble. "What did you say?" Richard demanded, leaning forward. "There must be a mistake. Read it again." "There is no mistake," Mr. Abernathy said calmly. "The house, the bank accounts, the investment portfolio, it all goes to Clara. The language is ironclad." "This is absurd." Eleanor shrieked, her voice losing its cultured composure. Mark would never do that. He would provide for his family. She must have manipulated him, coerced him. On the contrary, Eleanor, Mr. Abernathy said, his gaze unwavering. Mark seems to have anticipated this reaction, which brings us to the final page. He reached into the envelope and pulled out a single, separate sheet of paper. This is a personal codicil, a final statement from Mark, which he instructed me to read aloud in the event of any contest or dispute. He began to read Mark's final words. To my family, he read, his voice filling the silent room. If you are hearing this, it means you have behaved exactly as I feared you would. You have shown my wife disrespect in her time of grief and have valued my possessions more than my memory. For years, I watched you underestimate her, dismiss her, and treat her as less than. You failed to see that her quiet strength was greater than all of your blustering power. Her integrity, more valuable than our entire portfolio. This will is not an insult. It is a consequence. He continued. The assets I have left to my wife were earned not just by me, but by us together. The home is hers. Her future is hers to command. To my father, I leave the business you value so much. To my mother, the heirlooms you cherish. To my brother, the trinkets you desire. You have all received what you truly care about. But my love, my legacy, and my loyalty belong to Clara, and with them, everything else. Do not contest this. I have left Mr. Abernathy with extensive documentation of your financial indiscretions over the years, funds that, if made public, would cause irreparable damage to the Cameron name. This is my final act of protection for the only person who ever truly loved me for who I was, and not for what I could provide. Goodbye. When he finished, you could have heard a pin drop. The arrogance had evaporated from their faces, replaced by a mixture of shock, fury, and utter humiliation. Richard was ashen-faced. Eleanor was openly weeping, not tears of grief, but of impotent rage. Liam just stared, his mouth hanging open. I stood up slowly, my legs surprisingly steady. I looked at the three of them, these people who had caused me so much pain, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty pity. The meeting is over, I said, my voice clear and calm. David and I will see ourselves out. I expect you to have all of your personal belongings removed from my house by the end of the day. The locks will be changed at 5 p.m. And with that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the ruins of the Cameron dynasty behind me. I didn't look back. For the first time in 10 years, I was walking into a future that was entirely my own. Walking out of that law office and into the bright Boston sunlight was a physical sensation, a jolt to the system. It felt like stepping out of a pressurized cabin into the open air. The difference so profound my ears seemed to pop. The air was crisp. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. And for the first time since the moment I'd received that life-shattering phone call, the crushing, invisible weight on my chest began to lift. David walked beside me in a comfortable, steadfast silence, a human anchor in the swirling sea of my emotions. He didn't offer platitudes or congratulations. He just was, a presence that was both protective and permissive, allowing me the space to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. When we reached the sidewalk, pausing before rejoining the flow of the city, he finally turned to me, his face breaking into a slow, genuine smile. He really loved you, Clara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He saw this all coming. He made sure you'd be okay. I felt the corners of my own mouth lift. A real smile, the first one in months that felt like it reached my eyes. I nodded, a wave of profound gratitude washing over me. Yes, I said, the word a simple, solid truth. He did. My first act as a free woman, as the sole commander of my own life, was to call a locksmith. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. It was a practical necessity that felt like a sacred ritual. I arranged to meet him at my house, and the thought rang through my head like a bell. Clear and true, my house at precisely 4:45 p.m. When I arrived, a sleek, black SUV was pulling away from the curb, driving just a little too fast. The Camerons were gone. I walked up the stone path and saw that the front door was slightly ajar, as if they had left in too much of a hurry to close it properly. Inside, the house was filled with an eerie silence, but it was a clean, peaceful emptiness, not the suffocating presence of their judgment. They had cleared out their things in what I could only imagine was a flurry of angry, resentful activity. The heavy, ornate guest room furniture they'd brought in was gone. Liam's carelessly discarded clothes were gone. The oppressive Cameron portraits had been ripped from the walls, leaving pale, ghostly rectangles on the wallpaper, scars that I would eventually heal. The locksmith, a kind man with gentle hands, arrived on time. "Changing the locks, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "Complete overhaul. New deadbolts, new tumblers. I want a system that only I have the key to." As he worked, drilling and fitting, the metallic sounds echoed through the house, each click and turn a note in my symphony of liberation. I walked through the rooms, a queen surveying her reclaimed kingdom. In the living room, I ran my hand over the indentation in the armchair where I had sat during our final failed conversation, a silent witness to their gaslighting. In the study, I breathed in the scent of old books and cedar, a space now safe from Liam's vapid ambitions. In our bedroom, I stood before the nightstand and picked up Mark's journal. It was safe. His words, our memories, they were safe. When the locksmith finished, he handed me a set of gleaming new brass keys. They felt heavy and substantial in my palm, like a medal I had earned. "All set, ma'am," he said. "Nobody's getting in without your permission now." The simple, professional statement landed with the force of a prophecy. My permission, a concept that had been alien in this house for far too long. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I ordered takeout from my favorite little Thai restaurant on Newbury Street, the one Mark and I had called our special occasion spot. I opened a bottle of Chateauneuf du Pape, a wine we had been saving, and I sat on the floor in the middle of the vast, empty living room, surrounded by a silence that felt like a blessing. There was no one to please, no one to perform for. The quiet wasn't lonely. It was a balm, a gentle hand on my frayed nerves. I ate my pad see ew straight from the carton, the rich, savory flavors, an explosion on a palate that had tasted nothing but ash for weeks. I raised my wine glass to the empty room, to the ghost of the man who was everywhere and nowhere at once. "To you, Mark," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "Thank you. You magnificent, brilliant man. You won." The fallout from the will reading, the aftershock of the earthquake I had triggered, came faster and more spectacularly than I could have imagined. The first tremor arrived 2 days later. My phone buzzed, and the name Eleanor Cameron flashed on the screen. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail. But a newfound curiosity, a clinical detachment, made me answer. Her voice, usually so controlled and imperious, was thin and panicked, stripped of its usual layers of condescension. "Clara." The card was declined, she said, dispensing with any preamble or greeting. "I'm sorry. What card are you referring to, Eleanor?" I asked, my voice calm and even, a stark contrast to her frantic tone. "The Amex, the Centurion card, my card. I was at Neiman Marcus. They were holding a vintage Chanel piece for me, and it was declined. In front of everyone. It was utterly, completely humiliating." I took a slow sip of the tea I was drinking. "Ah, that card," I said, as if recalling a distant memory. That was a supplementary corporate card issued on the MC Holdings account, an entity that was part of Mark's personal trust, I explained, reciting the information I had gleaned from my late-night deep dive into the family finances. As the new sole trustee of that estate, I was advised by Mr. Abernathy to review all expenditures. Seeing as the account was being used for a significant number of non-business-related purchases, which, I believe, is a rather serious issue with the IRS, I took the prudent step of closing that account yesterday. All of them. There was a choked, sputtering sound on the other end of the line. It was the sound of a queen realizing her treasury had been emptied. You can't do that," she stammered, the rage beginning to bubble through the shock. "I can," I replied simply, "and I have. I'd suggest you speak with Richard about your future shopping excursions." I paused, then added, "Goodbye, Eleanor," and I hung up before she could unleash the tirade I knew was coming. It was a small, decisive act, but it felt like toppling a statue. A week later, I heard from Liam. It wasn't a call, but a long, rambling voicemail, his usual bravado completely gone, replaced by the whining, entitled pleading of a child whose allowance has been cut off. "Hey, Clara, it's Liam," his voice began, slick with a false friendliness. "Listen, I know things were, tense at the reading, but there's no reason we can't be civil, right? Family is family. Anyway, the thing is, Dad totally cut me off. He's in a real mood, going on about tightening the belt because of the situation with the estate. The thing is, my rent is due, and the seed money for my new app, it's a game changer. Clara, it connects influencers with artisanal dog walkers. It's all on hold. Mark always supported my ventures. He believed in my vision. I just need a small loan, say $50,000, just to tide me over until the first round of funding comes in. Call me back." I listened to the entire message, a kind of morbid fascination washing over me. He still didn't get it. He still saw me as an extension of his brother, a resource to be tapped. He didn't see me as a person with agency, but as a bank vault he had temporarily lost the key to. With a flick of my thumb, I deleted the message and blocked his number. The Bank of Clara was permanently closed. The biggest aftershock, however, was the one I never witnessed directly, but the report I received from Mr. Abernathy was more satisfying than any screaming match. He called me a few days after my conversation with Eleanor. "Clara," he said, a note of amusement in his professional voice, "I received a call from Richard Cameron's attorney this morning. He was full of bluster and vague threats about contesting the will on grounds of undue influence." "And?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "And," Mr. Abernathy continued, "I informed him that any such action would trigger the full discovery process, as stipulated by Mark. I mentioned that I was in possession of certain files Mark had compiled regarding intrafamilial financial transfers. His lawyer scoffed, so I took the liberty of emailing him a single, redacted document. It was a file Mark had labeled Liam's Vegas Trip and the Missing Poker Debt, 2019. I remembered that trip. Liam had come back broke and terrified, and Mark had quietly handled it, a pained look on his face. "What happened then?" I asked. "The phone went very quiet for about 30 seconds, Mr. Abernathy said. Then his lawyer said, 'We will advise our client to respect the final wishes of his son.'" Richard had folded. The threat of public disgrace, of having the carefully constructed myth of the perfect Cameron family shattered by documented proof of their sordid realities, was the only language he truly understood. He retreated, pulling his family with him into a tight, defensive crouch, severing all contact. The silence that followed was deafening, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. In the weeks that followed, I began the slow, deliberate, and joyful process of reclaiming my life. I hired a team of cleaners to professionally deep clean the house, an exorcism in bleach and polish, symbolically scrubbing away the last traces of the Camerons' toxic presence. I took down the heavy, oppressive velvet drapes Eleanor had insisted on and let the glorious, unfiltered sunlight stream in. I filled the house with flowers bright, cheerful peonies and hydrangeas and put on music, the jazz and classical records Mark and I had loved, which had been silenced for too long. I started a new routine, small acts of independence that felt like revolutionary statements. I took long morning walks along the Charles River, a thermos of coffee in hand, watching the rowers glide across the water. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter on Saturdays, losing myself in the simple, honest affection of abandoned dogs and cats. I reconnected with old friends, the ones I had neglected while trying to keep up with the exhausting demands of being a Cameron daughter-in-law. Each coffee date, each long phone call, felt like finding a piece of myself I thought was lost forever. The grief from Mark was still there, of course. It was a constant companion, a shadow that walked beside me. But its shape was changing. It was less of an anchor pulling me down into the depths, and more of a compass, its needle pointing me toward a life he would have been proud of. I was finally free. The silence in my home was no longer a sign of loss, but a canvas upon which I could finally begin to paint my own future. 1 year to the day after the will reading, I stood on the newly renovated rooftop terrace of the Boston Public Library. The city skyline, a view Mark and I had both adored, spread out before me, glittering under the evening sky. It was the launch party for the Mark Cameron Memorial Literacy Program, a foundation I had established using a portion of the trust he had left me. The foundation's mission was simple: to fund literacy and arts programs in underserved communities across the city. It was everything Mark believed in, and it was the perfect way to transform his legacy from a name on a building into a living, breathing force for good. My life was unrecognizable from the one I had been living under the Camerons' shadow. The brownstone was no longer just a house. It was a home filled with warmth, laughter, and friends. David and his wife were frequent dinner guests. My own family, who had been kept at a distance by the Camerons for years, were now a constant, loving presence. My parents would come over on Sundays, my father helping me in the garden, and my mother filling the kitchen with the scent of her baking, marveling at how much I had come into my own. "We have our daughter back," my mother had said to me recently, her eyes filled with tears. Professionally, I had made a significant change. While I still loved the library, running the foundation had ignited a new passion in me. I had enrolled in a nonprofit management program at Boston University and had discovered a talent for fundraising and community organizing I never knew I possessed. I was no longer just Mark's quiet wife. I was Clara Cameron, a respected philanthropist and community leader, a name I was building for myself on my own terms. The Camerons, on the other hand, had seen their world shrink dramatically. The justice that was served wasn't a loud, dramatic courtroom victory, but a quiet, inevitable crumbling that came from their own actions. Richard, without the influx of capital from Mark's more modern and profitable ventures, had been forced to sell off 2 of the family's subsidiary companies to cover debts. The Cameron empire was still standing, but it was diminished, a shadow of its former glory. He had become a more reclusive figure in the Boston business world, the whispers of the scandalous will reading having tarnished his carefully curated image. Eleanor's fate was, in a way, more poetic. Stripped of her unlimited expense account, her social standing took a significant hit. The fair-weather friends who had flocked to her lavish parties disappeared when the champagne stopped flowing. I heard through the grapevine that she spent most of her days in the cavernous mansion, a queen ruling over an empty kingdom. She had called me once, about 6 months after the reading. The call was stiff and awkward. She wanted to know if I would consider funding a new wing for her favorite art museum, a wing to be named after the Cameron family. It was a transparent attempt to reclaim social relevance. I politely declined, explaining that the foundation's funds were strictly earmarked for literacy programs. "That's a shame," she had said, her voice dripping with ice. Mark always understood the importance of high culture. He had, but he also understood the importance of helping those in need, a lesson she had never learned. As for Liam, his life had completely unraveled. Without the endless safety net of his father's money and Mark's quiet bailouts, his series of failed startups finally caught up with him. His condo was foreclosed on, his luxury car was repossessed, and he had been forced to get a real job, a sales position at a car dealership. David had run into him once and said he looked tired and defeated. All the entitled swagger gone, replaced by the weary resignation of a man forced to confront reality for the first time at age 31. They had not tried to contact me again after Eleanor's call. The boundaries were set, and for the first time, they were respecting them, not out of a change of heart, but out of a lack of leverage. Their power over me had always been an illusion, built on my compliance and their financial control. Once Mark removed those two pillars, their entire structure collapsed. As the speeches at the foundation launch began, I looked out at the crowd. I saw the faces of the students who would receive scholarships, the teachers whose classrooms would get new books, the community leaders who were now my partners. This was Mark's true legacy. It wasn't in corporate balance sheets or high society galas. It was here, in the promise of a better future for others. I felt a hand on my arm and turned to see David smiling at me. "He would be so damn proud of you, Clara," he said. I knew he was right. I was no longer just the guardian of Mark's memory. I was the architect of his legacy, and in doing so, I had finally built a life that was truly, completely my own. The quiet librarian had found her voice, and it was changing the world, one book at a time. As I stood on that rooftop, amidst the buzz of hopeful conversation and laughter, surrounded by the tangible results of Mark's love and my own newfound strength, I had a moment of profound clarity. For years, I had defined my worth through the lens of the Camerons. I was the quiet one, the accommodating one, the one who wasn't quite good enough. I had contorted myself into smaller and smaller shapes to fit into their world, believing that this was the price of love and family. But I was wrong. The journey of the past year had taught me the most important lesson of my life. Your value is not determined by how others see you, but by how you choose to see yourself. Mark had always seen me for who I truly was. His final act wasn't just about giving me financial independence. It was about giving me back to myself. He knew that without him there to act as a shield, I would either be consumed by his family's toxicity or I would be forced to find my own strength. And he bet on my strength. The will, the letter, the secret plan, it was all an elaborate, loving testament to his faith in me. He didn't save me. He simply handed me the tools I needed to save myself. He believed that beneath the quiet librarian's exterior was a will of steel, a resilience that even I hadn't recognized. He had seen all the times I had bitten my tongue to silence myself in the face of Eleanor's condescension, all the times I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace for him. He saw it not as weakness, but as patience, a patience that had its limits. The greatest irony is that in trying to strip me of everything, the Camerons gave me the one thing I never had: true freedom. Freedom from their judgment, freedom from the need for their approval, and freedom to build a life aligned with my own values. I learned that true family isn't about blood or a shared last name. It's about respect. It's about seeing the humanity in one another. It's about the people who show up when the world falls apart, like David did. It's about the people who loved you before you had a powerful name, like my own parents. The Camerons were my in-laws, but they were never my family. True family would never see your grief as an opportunity, or your love as a commodity to be seized. The money Mark left was a powerful tool, yes, But the real inheritance was the lesson in setting boundaries. It's a painful but necessary process. It requires you to accept that you cannot change how some people are, and that protecting your own peace is not selfish, it is essential. I had to mourn not just the loss of my husband, but the loss of the fantasy of the family I had hoped to have. I had once dreamed of cozy holidays, of Eleanor becoming a confidant, of Richard looking at me with pride. But in letting go of that illusion, I made space for a reality that was so much more authentic and fulfilling. My life now is quieter in some ways, but it is infinitely richer. It is rich with purpose, with genuine connection, and with a hard-won sense of self-respect that no one can ever take away from me again. Looking back, I can see the warning signs were there from the beginning, like tiny hairline fractures in a wall you willfully ignore until it crumbles. The passive-aggressive comments about my clothes, the probing questions about my career, the way they always referred to me as Mark's wife instead of Clara. Each of those small slights was an affirmation that in their world, I was defined by my relationship to them, not by my own merit. And I accepted it. I accepted it because I loved Mark, and I thought that sacrifice was a component of love. I thought that by making myself smaller, I was making our life together easier. But the greatest lesson Mark taught me, even after he was gone, is that true love doesn't demand your erasure. True love elevates you. It protects you. It sees the best version of you even when you can't see it yourself. Mark's love for me wasn't a gilded cage. It was a pair of wings he had been secretly crafting for me, knowing that one day I would need them to fly. And finally, I had learned how to use them. My life is built on a different foundation now. The foundation of choice. Every day, I choose how I will spend my time, who I will spend it with, and what I will devote my energy to. The Mark Cameron Memorial Literacy Program isn't just a project, it's a statement. It's a statement that his legacy will be one of empowerment, not control. That his name will be associated with opening doors for others, not slamming them in the face of a grieving woman. And I have forgiven them. Not because they deserve it, but because I deserve peace. Forgiveness isn't a declaration that what they did was okay. It will never be okay. Forgiveness was me unchaining myself from the anchor of their bitterness and choosing to walk away. My anger served its purpose. It was the fuel that got me through the confrontation. But I couldn't run on that fuel forever. To truly build a new life, I had to leave it behind. Their fate, a dwindling empire, a lost social standing, a harsh dose of reality was the natural consequence of their own choices. It was not my revenge. It was the universe balancing its books. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Mark hadn't left that plan in place. Would I have found the strength to fight? Or would I have accepted that condominium, lived out a downsized life, haunted by what I had lost? I want to believe that I would have found my way eventually, but I am eternally grateful that he illuminated the path for me. He gave me a starting point, a necessary push to remind me of the woman he had seen all along. My life now is a testament to that lesson. It is woven from the threads of resilience and self-worth. It is built on the solid rock of truth, not the shifting sands of others' approval. I am still a librarian at heart, someone who finds joy in order, in knowledge, and in stories. But now, I am writing my own story, and it is a story of liberation. It's a story about a woman who was defined by others for a decade, only to find that her true identity was waiting in the pages of a secret letter, in the quiet strength of her own heart. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you were underestimated, only to discover a strength you never knew you had? What did that experience teach you about yourself and the people around you? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Our stories of resilience have the power to connect us and lift each other up. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories about overcoming adversity and finding your own power. And don't forget to share this with someone who might need a reminder that even in the darkest of times, they have the strength to write their own final chapter. Thank you for listening. Remember, the most powerful stories are not the ones that are given to you, but the ones you have the courage to claim for yourself.